Hello and welcome to That Tech Show, the show that reveals the magicians behind the magic that is everyday technology. This week on the show we have Johannes Brodwall. Chris, tell us a little bit about Johannes.
Johannes is a Norwegian software engineer, architect, teacher and influencer whose work saves lives and keeps people safe. We talk about Norwegian Search and Rescue, including the challenges and logistics of organising public, private and voluntary sectors when things really matter. And we talk about Norway's version of the Test and Trace app for COVID-19, how the initial app raised some serious security concerns, and the part he played in remedying those.
Well, I have to say, this week's episode is an absolute cracker. I wasn't around for the recording, so it was Chris flying solo in this one. So without further ado, here is Johannes Brodwall.
I'm Johannes Brodwall. I'm from Oslo, Norway. I have worked for about 20 years building software and teaching others how to build software. Currently, I work on a program that's used to hopefully save lives in search and rescue operations. I do that work through Soprestera, which is a pretty large consultancy, both in Norway and in the rest of Europe. But as a side gig, also through my employer, I teach lately remotely at a local college, and I've also been part of the professional council or advisory board for the Norwegian contact tracing application, which was in its first incarnation pretty harshly criticized for poor privacy, but in its current incarnation it's in a much better state. So those are probably the most interesting highlights of my career, I think, at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, and there's plenty for us to unpack, I think, today. But to start with, tell us a little bit about your background then. So how did you get started? You've been in the industry for 20 years. What got you into technology?
I think it was pretty much accidental. I was in my teenage years. I had a Commodore 64 at home, so I'm from that generation, and I really did not understand it at all. I thought BASIC was the weirdest thing ever. I was totally unable to do anything more than write down from gaming magazines. I would write the code, the basic code for some simple programs, and I had no clue what was going on. So I pretty much concluded that computers were not for me.
So how did that all turn around then?
Well, when I started at the university, I thought I would study physics. Uh-huh. And I did really poorly in physics, but I had to do computer science as a lecturer, and I really enjoyed it. So I thought in my teenage years that I would not do anything much with computers, but when I started learning it in earnest, I thought it was pretty interesting. So it's kind of, I think it's sort of the way you're supposed to have a career, but everybody else has a more interesting origin story, I think.
Well, was there a light bulb moment then when it all of a sudden started to make sense for you? Because I think I went through a similar thing, really, of finding coding hard when I was a kid. I didn't have a Commodore 64. It's amazing how many Commodore 64s there are in people's past, but unfortunately I didn't have one. But was there a light bulb moment for you when you figured out it all makes sense now?
I can't really pinpoint that light bulb moment, but I've seen it in others now. Now I'm starting to get a little bit of gray hair, and so I don't remember everything from back then. But when I teach now at college, I can see, so I teach the third semester that the students have in computers or technology. And at that point in time, there is a pretty big divide between students that have grokked it and students that haven't. And it's I think a very fun semester to teach, because a lot of students get over that, get through that light bulb moment. And I've started really recognizing this because there is a cognitive leap that you have to take to kind of, I guess it is when you start compiling the code in your head, when you start mentally debugging, when you start executing the code as the computer would, and everything starts making sense. Before that, it's kind of just magic formulas, and nobody really. And in the first years, I think a lot of students really have no mental model to reflect what's going on.
Yeah, it's still a little bit magic, I think, how it all goes from being computer code into pictures and images and all of that sort of stuff. I think, how does it get down to being zeros and ones? It's still a little complicated.
Yeah.
There's certain gaps in the knowledge, I think, for everybody. But I'd like to talk about this search and rescue operation. So how on earth did you get involved in doing search and rescue? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Especially in Norway, but it might be the case in other parts of the world as well. The search and rescue operations are a joint effort. We're a huge country in terms of geography, not so many people, and that means that when there is a boat that capsizes or somebody is lost in the mountains on a hiking trip, you might not have the right people around. For as long as we've done systematic search and rescue in Norway, so you have the voluntary sector, you have organizations like the Red Cross and others. You have the commercial sectors. In Norway, we have fish farms, and many of these fish farms have boats that have cranes and that have rescue equipment on them. But they're not part of the rescue service as such. And then you have the government rescue operation as well, which is people from the police. You have the fire rescue service, and you have helicopters, rescue helicopters, and different, and of course Coast Guard. And these have different chains of command. I mean, first you have the private, the volunteer, and the public sector, and all of those have obvious different chains of commands. But also within the public sector, there's military, like the Coast Guard is part of the military, and there's police, which is part of another sector. There's the Coastal Service, which is part of the transportation department. So there's
quite a lot of different sectors to navigate.
Exactly. So about 8 years ago, before I was involved, the Coastal Service in Norway started a project to try and coordinate these different resources that can be used in rescue operations. And the problem that they have in that setting is that in order to do this, you need a pretty good mix of skills with building a UI. You need integration skills. We're also making apps for reporting people's position. You have to have pretty good user insight. You have to be able to deliver software quickly, and you cannot have a very big team because this is trying to improve something that is already done. So you don't have a huge budget for it. So they really couldn't hope to recruit, I think, a professional software development team that would work inside of the Coastal Service, because they do a lot of things that have very little to do with software. So getting like a world-class or national-class software engineering team is pretty difficult. And so in order to do this project, they could have asked for a traditional government tender where they have a requirement specification, ask different consultancies or different contractors what price they would need to build it, and so on. But the problem in this situation, especially when you're in a coordinated environment with lots of actors that are moving, that have their own projects, so each of these volunteer organizations have their own procurements of different IT solutions. It might be a new app that they're using. It might be integration with the CRM system. They might have something where they cannot afford to change it at this point in time. So you need to be agile in what you're building as well, because you have to seize the opportunities that are there. So both in terms of the tender and in terms of the contract, the Coastal Service had a pretty innovative, I think, agile approach to the contracting.
So how's this actually set up then?
The initial contract, the awarding the contract, was done through a actual competition, if you like.
All right.
So I think there was about 5 suppliers or so, and each of those got hired for, I think, 2 sprints, like 4 weeks, where they were supposed to show the customer how do you work in an agile way, how do you clarify requirements, how do you deliver software, how do you develop, how does your teams work, and then at the end of these 2 iterations, what can you deliver?
That's interesting. So did they get paid for that delivery, or was it this is part of the tender?
I was not involved at that point in time, so I can speculate freely, and I'll say yes, they definitely got paid for it.
Okay, so we may or may not know the answer to that.
Exactly. So I think that in a contract like that, that's certainly on the table, that you would then pay 5 suppliers for running these 4 weeks of software development. And then in this situation, they awarded 2 contracts for 2 different parts of the total scope. So we are one of the suppliers, and one of our good competitors is another supplier, and I'm sure they're also doing a very good job with the parts that they're developing.
That's a really novel way of putting out a tender. I mean, I don't think I've heard of that before.
No, I don't think I've heard it before or after, and I really like the approach.
Yeah, it's very clever. So what you're saying, that's about 8 years ago?
Yeah, I think so.
That's especially even for 8 years ago. That's very, very novel. How interesting. In terms of how it was awarded then, and the parts that you and your competitor, doing a very good job as well, are concerned about, how are those 2 responsibilities divided, and do you as competitors have to work together also?
The way that they have split up this total program, we're pretty far divided, so we don't have much to do with each other.
So you can remain competitors and enemies.
Yeah, I mean, we probably would be able to work pretty well together anyway, because we would have a pretty clearly defined interface. And in essence, it would not be much different from 2 teams both trying to do their best inside of a company. But I think that the Coastal Service probably could have gotten some more benefits if we had been able to integrate the teams more closely, but that's even harder, I think, than pulling off this kind of process in the first place.
Absolutely. So the area of responsibility that you are responsible for is coordinating all of these different vessels, aircraft, vehicles, equipment, personnel as well. That's a hell of a lot of stuff to have to deal with. How do you approach a problem like that? Because it's quite unique. You know, most of us are dealing with building e-commerce websites. Broadly, that's probably the biggest area that we all work in. So obviously, some people get to work in much more exciting areas like this. So tell us, how do you start designing an application that deals with that, and what are the difficulties you have to solve?
One of the difficulties is obviously the type of information you want to put into the system is pretty hard to determine to begin with, and it might be somewhat dynamic as well.
A lot of different sources as well, I imagine.
Yeah, so there has to be a combination of the human effort and the technical effort as well. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a company called Redningsselskapet in Norwegian, let's say the rescue company, which is a foundation. They own a lot of rescue boats that are used for coastal rescue. And they're technically a private organization, a foundation that lives on donations from their members. They're called the Sea Rescue Society.
Right.
They have their processes where they know where all of their all their vessels are, what state they're in, and so on. Our job is to make sure we know both people with a sort of business responsibility and people with a technical responsibility. So in the case of Sea Rescue Society, I think it was them that one of my colleagues had a phone call this morning with the CTO, I think, it's a pretty small IT organization, but we had a personal call with them, and we know them by their first names. We know we coordinate on their schedules and our schedules so that we make changes to our API when they need those changes to be made. I guess it's pretty much the same as in any other field. You have to know your customers, you have to know your users, you have to talk with your users. Similarly, we had one of our other voluntary organizations sent an email to one other of my colleagues that he forwarded to me about some problems they had on Sunday with a rescue operation where our system didn't quite perform as it should have. I called him back, and first I examined the bug a little bit, so I know that I can reproduce the behavior. I have a pretty good idea of what he experienced. And this is someone who's a volunteer, as far as I know, for one of these volunteer organizations. But he's got a coordinating role. And so I called him up and said, we're from a team that makes the software that you used, and I got this email. I just wanted you to know that we think this is a pretty serious issue. I think I've got it resolved, and I hope to have a bug by Wednesday, fixed by Wednesday. And I think that having that care for your users, so the interest in what they're doing, the personal contact, that is always key.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite a hard problem to solve as well, I'd guess, because, you're talking about having a bug there, and incidents and issues in this sort of scenario, people might die, I guess. So it's quite an important job to make sure that these things are working as expected.
Yes.
So how do you make sure that these things are as well structured as possible? I imagine, we talked about tests earlier. I imagine this needs a particularly strong test harness around it.
Testing is a part of it, and but what always slips through the net is what you didn't think of to test, which was the case in this particular situation. I can actually go into the details of the bug. It's kind of interesting coincidence there.
Sure.
The second part is to have monitoring, and I built my own monitoring dashboards that have traffic lights for all of the instances of our software running on all of the servers. So I actually have it on the screen next to me as we speak. So if something starts blinking red, then I might drop out for a moment. So
that's no problem. Absolutely, we would understand that you need to go and deal with some of these things.
But generally, I mean, the services are not frequently used, but when they're used, it can matter quite a bit.
Well, yeah. I mean, to return to what you were saying before about Norway being such a vast country. With such a small population, because 5.3 million or something people?
Something like that. I think you've got better numbers than me.
It's because we've had Norwegians on before, and we've spoken about about some of the population sizes of Norway, so that's embedded in the brain now. You are such a huge country, and having to do that coordination between all of the different types of services you talked about, including the public. How do you deal with that coordination? I mean, the business rules into that must be particularly complex, but
so we want to avoid complex business rules because the business rules are not used very often, and when they're used, it matters a lot. So it will be very speculative. There are two pieces of information that is the most important to us in the rescue operation. The first one is the location, and the second one is the phone number of how you can activate a resource. So that means if there's a rescue dog, you need to know where is the owner and where's the dog, or rather, is the dog with the owner is a important question. So how quickly can they be there, and who do you call to get them to join this rescue operation or SMS? Similarly, what phone number do you call to get to the captain on one of those rescue vessels? And those are pretty simple, old-fashioned information, but that's what it boils down to.
Do you rely on a lot of location-based data for these things as well?
We try and get it as much as we can from various sources, and we've tried to have business rules around our location data. So when the coordinators, when they're looking at the different resources in a map or in a list, they want to know, is this location, is it recent or is it old? And we used to have a pretty complex set of business rules to determine whether we showed the dot in orange or blue. So we call those raspberries or blueberries. And
what's the significance of the colours?
The blue have a recently updated location.
Right, I see.
And then we had some rules for when should a dot turn orange, go from being blue to being orange. And we discovered that our users did not understand at all those rules. And it was very hard to kind of get a grasp around it. And then we went down to saying, if the location has been updated within 24 hours, it's blue. Otherwise, it's red. So the less complexity, the easier it is for us and for the users.
So that's much simpler. But you must have to deal with a lot of data coming through if you're going to be taking some of these location updates. How do you process that data and make sure that it's as accurate as possible?
It's not that much data, actually.
Really?
So we're coordinating few different sources. A lot of the information is publicly available, like AIS. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but the radio trackers that are on all vessels is a public source that we're consuming. We have a dedicated source for some things like the Sea Rescue Society, and we have some dedicated sources for various other locations as well.
With volunteers, are you taking in data from their usage of the app as well?
Yeah, so they have. We've created a custom app for our volunteers where they can consent to reporting their current location. So, in that situation, privacy is obviously a concern. So we want to make sure that it's totally voluntary for these volunteers to report their location, and that they understand who gets the location, and that they understand that we only keep the last location that we have, so that we don't track them. We get the current location.
Was there any complexity in setting that up and communicating the type of data that you were going to collect? Because this is a nice segue into some other parts of the conversation that we're going to go into, but data collection and privacy is pretty key in apps, and there's a whole load of talk about that in the UK at the minute and for various other different applications. How did you guys work around it for this particular application?
We actually had to go forward and be more concerned about it than most of our users, because most of the users, they are in these voluntary organizations because they like to go on rescue missions out in the wilderness. That's what they want to do, right? They wouldn't join these organizations if they didn't care about being part of these operations. And the fact that their location is shared with the rescue services, the public rescue services, that's for, I think, everybody we've talked to think that is a very nice thing to have happen. But of course, we have to think about those few that don't want it, and those situations where it can be abused nevertheless. One thing is that if you were part of a rescue operation, then the rescue services know that you were there and they know that you were in that location. That's part of the operation. But of course, the app also reports your location when you're at home, or when you're at a hospital giving where your kids are getting born. Maybe you might be at a mistress. You never know what kind of a situation people are in, and sometimes it's not something you want to share. And then to be aware of those complexities, I think Most users stumble into a situation if they ever get into a situation where they are concerned about privacy, they stumble into it. It wasn't something that they were concerned about until all of a sudden they became concerned about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So we have to be forward and try and make sure that we don't collect information we don't need to have. And I think from my perspective, the most important consideration is that of retention. In our scenario, we only need to give the current location of a person. The historical location is not relevant. With the exception of when you're part of a rescue operation. So when you're on the job, then the location might be important for example, for analyzing how the operation was executed, whether we searched all the places we should have searched and so on. But we haven't really gotten to that part yet. So we've made sure that everything from the database design up is geared towards only having the most recent location of the person.
Was there something that led you to that sort of conclusion, or is this something that, did you start from that point of view, or is that something that you came to over time?
I think that we started from that point of view in this situation because I had been inoculated with privacy concerns a little bit earlier. I was part of a task force with the Norwegian Data Protection Agency to create a set of guidelines for privacy by design. And
that's
I was
interesting.
Fresh off of that work.
So is this right? So in terms of the direction we're going now, is this to do with your equivalent of the test and trace app within Norway, or is this before?
It's way before. It was,
way before. Okay, so how did you get involved in that initially, and then we'll take that through to the to this test and trace equivalent in Norway.
Right. So I think that we all were pretty concerned in March of 2020. So I don't know about you, but I was certainly thinking, what can I do to help? Or what can we as a profession do to help? And about, I think, March 20th or so, there was on the news in Norway, the Norwegian Institute of Public Health announced that they were planning to have this sort of contact tracing application where the app would register who you were close to and it could alert you if you had been close to somebody who had been infected. So it was a research organization, Simula Research Laboratory, who was initially suggesting this app, and they're not really a software development company or an app company. So I right away offered that Soprasteria could provide some of the manpower needed to make this app. We had a little bit of dialogue with the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, but of course they were pretty jammed down with everything going down, so they couldn't pursue all of the different threads. But as I learned more about the plan, I was concerned that it didn't seem like they took privacy as a primary concern when developing this app. And I did try and get in contact with somebody there and say, whatever you do, make sure that you follow up on privacy because it will be a lot of hassle if you don't. And then you can say whether I was prophetic or whether I created that situation. I think people will dispute. Because as the details of this app was being known, together with a few other technology leaders in competing companies and elsewhere, we got together and wrote a joint statement requesting a upgrade of the privacy of this app.
Okay, so I mean, let's go back a little bit with this because obviously contact tracing applications started spinning up all over the globe. There was no real coordinated effort globally. They were all, I mean, in the UK, for example, there were several contact tracing apps were set up, including the one that was done by the National Health Service itself. And for more information on that, you can listen to episode 10 of our show, but because we've covered contact tracing before.
Yeah, that's a wider perspective as well. It was a very nice episode.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, it's a good conversation, and I think in terms of how this came about across the world, I'm not really particularly familiar with exactly how this came together in Norway. So obviously you had proposed through your organisation that this is something that you could help with. Were there other organisations in Norway that were creating their own sort of versions versus the one that was created by the government? I mean, talk to me a little bit about the backstory.
I think that pretty much everybody in Norway concluded right away that if this is to be done, it has to be done by the Institute of Public Health. It has to be done by the public sector. It cannot be championed by a private corporation. So I think everybody who was cognizant of this approach had offered their help for the public sector, but nobody, as far as I know, proposed their own initiative.
Was it developed pretty quickly then, the first version of the app?
Yeah, the first version of the app, so it was first discussed, as far as I know, just around lockdown, which was the 12th of March. There was some initial communication, and a lot of the backstory has been made public through freedom of information requests.
All right, okay.
So there's a lot of public information there. And the app was launched by the Prime Minister on a national press conference on, I think, the 26th of April.
So that's pretty quick then. I think that might be faster than we managed to... Well, it's certainly a lot faster than we had a working version in the UK.
Oh, well, yes. The first version that's there, through other freedom of information requests, that's actually available on GitHub now. They didn't want to make it available. At the point in time, they said first that it would be a security problem if it was available, like a threat. And second, they said they didn't want repressive governments around the world to get hold of this. That's actually a quote, which I thought was, yes.
Wow. So there must have been some security concerns in there then, definitely.
Well, yeah. But the app in itself was not that advanced. Basically, what it does is that you register with your phone number with the central database. You get an ID back from this central database, and then you would broadcast that ID on Bluetooth, and you would record all the ideas that you see together with with the strength of the radio signal, which is a proxy for distance. And you would also record GPS location or GPS trace, and you would continuously, or rather about, I think, once per hour, you would dump this up to, I think it was Azure IoT Hub that they used for this. So the app was not much more than a data harvesting device.
Yeah, and a lot of data as well, I presume.
A lot of data, and I mean, I think they did have some challenges getting just the throughput of the data here, but I haven't actually looked at the numbers for that. Then they would put all of the data in a central database, and they had your basic Python data analysis scripts which were supposed to analyze that data. They were able to collect, as far as we have as far as we've been able to establish, that we're able to collect data for the lifetime of the operation, or of the operation of the app. But the scripts are also available in GitHub, and it doesn't look like they could get very much out of the data at the point in time when the app was shut down.
So how do obviously you've got the app going live, you've got a very simple data harvesting device, you've got the privacy statement that yourself and a few others signed and put together. At what point did the app get taken down then?
It was taken down, think it was the 16th of June. So that
Right.
was less than 2 months of being alive.
Wow. And so how did this start to escalate then in terms of, was it denied initially, or, was there any pushback from the government?
The Norwegian Data Protection Agency were paying pretty close attention to the app, and initially they said we would never have allowed this app during peacetime situation.
Wow.
So they said this was that they were willing to entertain it for a while because it was such an exceptional situation. And they did send a few letters back and forth between the Institute of Public Health and Data Protection Agency. These are all public information. And as I read them, the Data Protection Agency said your data collection does not map well to your achievable purpose of collecting that data. So you're collecting data that you cannot use for the purpose that you've stated that you want to collect it.
Somewhat outside of the remit then, really? Like you're collecting too much data?
Or rather, you're not able to use the data that you're collecting.
Right, yeah.
Now, the answers that I saw seem to indicate that the term, when the Data Protection Agency said, so you're collecting more data than what's necessary for the purpose of the app, you can't justify the purpose of the app. Or rather, you have to explain more thoroughly the purpose of the app. They answered basically, the purpose of the app is to stop the pandemic. Of course, this is a good purpose. and
Can't really argue against that one.
Right. So I think there was a kind of misunderstanding between how specific a purpose for data collection have to be, and how that has to be directly related to the data that you're collecting.
The app was shut down in June, as you said. What happened then? What happened next?
A few days before it was shut down, there was a report from Amnesty International that had analyzed contact tracing applications in many parts of the world. And they said that Norway, together with, I think, Bahrain and Kuwait, had developed some of the most invasive mass surveillance tools they had ever surveyed.
Wow. That's quite an indictment.
And I mean, not to down-talk anyone in particular, but in general, putting Norway in the category of Middle Eastern countries in terms of having mass surveillance is not something we're very used to.
Well, yeah, that seems a little out of character for Norway, I think, in terms of what I know.
One would hope, but I mean, we do see some strange initiatives like this elsewhere as well. And so there was that report, and then pretty much off the heels of that, the Data Protection Agency issued a demand for suspension of data collection for the app. So that's a formal letter telling the Institute of Public Health that they have to stop using the app. And I think the same day or the day after, the Norwegian Parliament made a resolution that the app had to be split into separate purposes, because when it was initially launched, it was unique in that it had two purposes. First, it was to detect and contain infections. But second, it was to do research on the spread of infection, and also on whether people were following government recommendations or not. It was a little bit unclear what was within the scope of a research. But these two purposes, tracing infection and doing research, those are pretty different purposes.
Yes, I can understand that. I can see how they're connected, though, in a way.
You do need the same data for them, or you need some of the same data. But the fundamental difference is that if I'm using an app to detect infections or to stop infections, this is an app that I install for the purpose of protecting me and those around me.
Sure.
If I'm donating my data to a research program, that data is of a different character. Now, many people, I think, would consent to both purposes. But those are two very fundamentally different things that you're doing with the app. In the one case, I'm using this app to protect myself. In the other case, I am helping the government get data that they can use to better make changes and recommendations to prevent this infection and other infections in the future. And to require, and there was not in the app two separate consents for these two purposes, which is the first point in our statement against the app, was that when you have two purposes that are the separate, you have to have separate consent for those two purposes.
And so how has that evolved then? Has this evolved into two apps, or is it evolved into a single app with two consents?
They dropped the research part.
Oh, okay.
So
well, that's one way of dealing with it.
Yeah. Actually, they dropped the whole app and then they developed a different app.
Right. So how did that come about then? Was there a gap there where there was no app around?
Yes.
Did that negatively impact on the coronavirus response in Norway?
It's hard to say because we've been pretty lucky with how little coronavirus has affected us. Even at the worst, I think we've got less than 1,000 deaths, even from March in 2020.
Really?
So
wow.
So we were, through luck or other means, we were able to contain it much better than other countries.
What do you think it was that contributed to that? I mean, we're off the topic a little bit from technology, I suppose, but what do you think? What do you think sort of contributed to Norway having a better response? Were you guys just better at dealing with lockdown?
Well, there's the joke that's initially actually about Finns, but you can apply to Norwegians as well, which was to say that the government no longer has a recommendation that everybody keep a 2 meters distance, so everybody can go back to keeping their normal 3 meter distance that they normally do.
I
so this is of course probably not a true stereotype, but I think we are fewer people, and most of the country lives pretty spread out. So I think that for a large part of the population, it was easier to avoid crowds than what it would be most other places.
Do you guys have do you have a lot of people who are anti-mask, or are people just happy to wear a mask and get on with it?
We didn't have any perceivable anti-mask movement. We had a little bit of anti-vaccine movement, but
oh, really?
Not anti-mask as far as I've seen.
Yeah, London is a bit strange because that's where I'm based, and I don't know if it was exclusively or explicitly anti-mask. People just didn't bother wearing them, which was very strange. You'd have the government telling you you're in lockdown, and in fact we're supposedly still in lockdown at the moment. And you'd be hard pressed to find a mask, except for if you go into a shop. There's a lot of places you'll just walk around a relatively crowded street in London, as every street is crowded. No masks. People just don't bother. Which is probably why we've got one of the highest death rates.
Yeah, that's
really not a laughing matter, actually. But anyway, let's try and get back onto the to the topic of technology. So you talked about the letter that you'd written or you'd co-signed. You talked about your involvement in data protection way before that. So how did you get involved with data protection that would, I suppose, enough to put you as a signatory on that letter? Was it a special interest of yours to get involved in data protection?
Not really, but I've been pretty visible at conferences and special interest groups in Norway, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, I got a call from one of the people working at the data protection agency saying that they wanted experts on this guidelines for privacy by design and asked if I could join. And I hadn't given it much thought before then.
So this is an extension of your conference interest then?
Yeah.
So has it become a passion, data protection?
Definitely. There is both a positive and a negative side to data protection, and because what happened with the Norwegian contact tracing app was that it was shut down because they didn't pay attention to data protection. It suffered negative press because it didn't pay attention to privacy. And what we saw when they made the second app, which was a totally different approach, totally different architecture, totally different code base, is that the uptake of that app was much reduced because of the bad press of the first app.
All right, yeah. So get it wrong on data protection, and it has quite a significant consequence.
I think so, and I talked also with people who are normally not very interested in technology, or not primarily interested in technology, and heard several people saying, yeah, I installed the app because of a sense of duty, but I felt really bad about what I knew about the app. I wasn't happy about it. And I think that when you ignore that sort of concern that people have, then you hurt yourself a lot. And so from a PR point of view, from a architecture point of view, if you don't design your application with privacy in mind, then it does hurt your public relationship. It does hurt the uptake of the application. It does hurt your reputation. It does hurt all of the things that you care about if you want to have a successful application.
Do you think that I think it's interesting hearing you talk about this, especially from a Norwegian perspective. Do you think that people care more about data protection and privacy in Norway? Like, does it have an effect on how people use sort of social media applications in Norway?
I think that if anything, they generally care less about it. And I'll give one sort of explanation for why and one sort of data point for why I think that. We think of ourselves as a high-trust society. We think of ourselves as a country where the population has high trust in the goodwill of the government. In general, our politicians don't get rich out of being politicians. It's
that must be nice.
I think I think that most people generally think that, you might not like a politician, you might think they're stupid or have the wrong ideas or whatever, but you generally recognize that they are in it because they want to improve the world as they see it, not because they want to have personal enrichment. And I think there's a pretty high level of trust in both politicians and in the bureaucracy, that they might fail, they might have also different priorities, but they're fundamentally there because they care. And that means that that a lot of the public reaction was that, okay, I'm giving up a lot of data, but I trust the government to keep that data safe. And perhaps that trust was warranted in this situation, but I do also think that when the government is demanding more data of you, when the demands on your privacy are being increased, the trust will also eventually erode. So it is a limited capital, and you're spending it.
Was there much of an impact of the introduction of GDPR in Norway? Did that have as big an impact as it had here, with people thinking about how to re-architect applications, and then actually, to a certain degree, not doing that, but just having a process that was written down, because that's essentially what's happened over here? Yeah,
I think so. And I think that, from what I understand, the British and the Norwegian privacy laws are both pretty strong. So the laws before GDPR were pretty strong to begin with. So there weren't that many changes, but I think that people were a lot more aware of it, and people were a lot more afraid of it. But we did see this rush in was it 2016 when they had
it's a while ago now, actually, isn't it? I think it is 2016.
So we did see that rush of people wanting to meet this deadline and failing and having no consequences.
It does certainly seem to be that way. I think if you've got a piece of paper that says your policy for how you remove someone's data or give them their data, then that seems to do the job.
It does. But I mean, it's been pretty much as expected that policing has increased, and I think that's good to see. But it's also increased gradually. Like I'm pretty happy with the Norwegian Data Protection Agency because they seem to be pretty much straight shooters in this approach.
Oh, it certainly seems proactive from what you're saying. So in terms of your involvement of how you got involved with that, we talked about your conferences. So you're quite a prolific conference. Well, I suppose founder, actually, aren't you?
It's only been 2. So.
Well, I mean that's more than I've founded. So you started. Which one's the one you started the longest ago? 20 years ago, the Oslo XP meetup. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a user group or a meetup. So I started that I think in 2003 maybe, and. At that point in time, it was initially just an excuse for me and a couple of friends to get together, have a few drinks, and talk about software development. And then eventually, some more people started showing up, and that was very cool. And then eventually, we started having some talks, and speakers who were in Oslo from different parts of the world stopped by and gave talks. We had. Our biggest meetings were with about 110 attendees, I think.
It's very cool. That makes sense. Tying that back into your teachings of using pair programming and TDD, it makes sense that you would actually have that as a meetup group as well, I suppose.
It was pretty significant for my career path in the late 90s when I read Kent Beck's Extreme Programming Explained when it was first published. I've only practiced 7 to 10 of the 12 original practices at the same time, but I think it's a lot of good guidance that we got from that, and I wanted to influence the kind of project I ended up on. And
you've also founded the Norwegian Agile Conference as well?
Yeah, that was in 2007, the first year we had that, and I was part of the group running it until 2012, and then I gave it over to another group or other people. So we've had several generations of organizing committees since then, and currently I don't think I even know who's running it. And
but it's still running. You've handed it over.
Well, it stopped during Corona.
Understandably,
it ran last time in 2019, and they've changed the format pretty significantly the last couple of years, which I'm very happy to see. But it was kind of interesting because I think that they came and asked me whether it was okay for me if they changed the format. And I was like, it's yours now. Do whatever you like with it. That's the point. But it's something to watch out for when you're starting something, is that often people care about your opinions even after you've stopped having them.
It's interesting, though, that you were able to successfully found something and then hand it off. I think that's quite an achievement in itself.
That is something that I'm quite proud of, and I have to say that if the conference there turns into something even greater than I ever thought it could be, then I'm even happier than if that they took it further than I had the vision to do.
It's interesting that you went from finding, something interesting in the XP documentation to actually founding a meetup group, and then subsequently founding the Agile Conference as well. What was it that inspired you to get people together and coordinate? What was so important about those two things, XP and Agile, that made you decide I need to get people together to talk about this?
Well, when I started out, I thought that all of software development was a mess, and I didn't want to work in messy projects. As in, I mean, nobody knows what they're doing, and we don't produce results, and it's no fun to work with code bases that we don't understand and bugs that we don't understand. And like all young people, I thought that, you just need to have the right ideas and then everything will get fixed. And then I saw something that looked like the right ideas, and then I wanted to optimize the chance that I would end up with a project that had those ideas.
And so as a reflection for young people, how's that worked out for you over the last 20 years?
I think that the most successful part of it is the number of people that you meet, both professional contacts, but also inspiring people that you get to know over the years. So one thing that I've found is if you want to, know people who are influential in your local area, it's a pretty easy recipe for that, which is to know people that you think are nice and smart, and then wait for 20 years.
Oh, and they become the influencers over time. That does make sense. Absolutely. So that must have given you an opportunity to meet some really fantastic people over, 20 years of those two initiatives.
Yeah, very much. And so let's stick with the positive parts of that.
Well, on that note, we've barely scratched the surface on the test and trace topic. So let's go back. Talk us through the timeline and the evolution between those two apps.
We saw the first app that was launched with quite a bit of fanfare, and then died pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Then it was it took the Norwegian Institute of Public Health about half a year before they were able to launch the second version of the app. And in that launch, they did not want this to have the same fate. Mm-hmm. What they did was first they open sourced everything from the get-go, which was first it does give a lot of confidence to people that this is in their interest to install, but also I mentioned earlier that they got a lot of freedom of information type of requests. And they actually reported as noticing less work as they open sourced the software, because there were fewer prying eyes that wanted to get into seeing what they were doing. So developing in the open, I think, was less hassle for something that's of public interest like this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're dealing with a lot of freedom of information requests.
Yeah, and the second thing was that so they wanted to make everything public. We also made I also helped them make a public Slack for discussions around privacy concerns, technical concerns, whatever people wanted. So there is a public Slack operated by the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, where people can have a open discussion about these things. So the software development team is there. The project management is there. The risk officer is there.
Wow, how active is that?
It's still pretty active, but it was most active during the before or around the initial launch of the second version of the app. But currently we're sharing articles about contact tracing, both in Norway and other places, on the Slack. So there was today there was there's been a little bit of discussion recently about some press articles about how many people have been notified, how many people have installed the app, and so on. So and in that case, the crowd on the Slack is pretty supportive of the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and trying to do our best to advise them on how to deal with public pushback in one way or another. So they have this public Slack, and then in addition they asked the Norwegian Computing Association and also the Norwegian Union of Technical Workers, or like engineering workers, to nominate 2 people each for a advisory council on technical issues and especially privacy during the development of the second version. So I was nominated there. I joined this committee as a representative of the Norwegian Computing Association.
Wow.
And we had weekly meetings where they would present the risk assessment, they would present the protocols. When the source code was launched, had a guided walkthrough where we could start looking at this. And through this, there was a concern because with these new or the current generation of contact tracing apps, you have basically your contact information is just stored on your phone until you're reported as being infected. And then you have to upload those to what's basically a bulletin board where everybody can compare it to what they've stored on their phone. This is the basic protocol of the Distributed Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing Protocol, or the DP3T protocol.
Wow. Is that a global protocol, or is that something that was specific to Norway?
This was the one that Google and Apple implemented in their exposure notification framework. It came out of a research collaboration mostly in Europe. And the first app to launch on it was in Switzerland, which was at the end of May of 2020. So Norway was pretty late in this, and Denmark launched a pretty similar app to the Norwegian one, and the company that adapted the technology for Denmark was able to reuse that in Norway. So they actually were awarded the tender of developing the app for Norway as well. And the Danish health authorities let them keep the source code. So we were lucky in inheriting. So that's legacy code, but in a positive sense, we got Denmark's legacy.
The open sourcing method that you talked about, though, is quite unique, I suppose.
Yeah, possibly. And there's an interesting story about that as well. Because so you have this concern that when people post their contact points to the public bulletin board so others can see if they've been exposed, you want to make sure that they were actually infected. So that you don't have people like jokers scaring people unnecessary. And in most countries, what you do is you get a code either with SMS or you get it from your doctor, and you type that code into your app to upload it. So it's sort of an authorization code. But Norway, I think, is pretty far ahead in having a national registry of infectious diseases. So we have, so when you do a coronavirus test, the result of that test is stored in a database operated by the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. And what they did is that they implemented a authorization where you can use your national ID to authorize with their the infection database, and then it can check whether you're infected or not, and it can use that as authorization for uploading the data. And that's very good for this security issue of people not uploading false data. But it reintroduces a privacy issue, which is that now you've got those contact points associated with your national identifier. So now you know what person that is. And that can be something, for example, if somebody wants to prove that you and I were in contact, and if I uploaded my contact information and they get hold of your phone, they can correlate that and see that we were indeed in contact.
So how do you work around that then?
That's the interesting bit, because this is of course much more of a public concern than it is of a health concern. This is something that people who are concerned about privacy rate as higher priority than people who are concerned about health, and that's the way it should be, right? And you got the situation where you got a company that had a contract to develop this application by a deadline, the 21st of December. And their contract is to develop an application that can track infection or track contact. It's not to develop this privacy part. But you also got people who are concerned about privacy wants this to be done in a private way. And so a researcher from NTNU, which is the Norwegian Technical and Scientific University up in Trondheim, he wrote a paper on how you could introduce a higher level of anonymity in this. We call it anonymous tokens. And the way it works is that basically you encrypt a value, you upload it to the infection registry, which signs the encrypted value. You get the signed encrypted value back, you decrypt it, and now the decrypted value, you can prove that it was signed, but you can't correlate it to which of the tokens were signed, and you use that as an authorization. This is the same protocol as is used by Privacy Pass, which was originally, I think, developed to avoid having CAPTCHA of all things. And so in these meetings with advisory board, me and the other 3 people who were there, we brought with us this paper, and we were in dialogue with this cryptographic researcher, and we said, we think this would be a really great thing to have in the app. And the Norwegian Institute of Public Health said, this looks like a good idea. We don't have the time to do it. Will you make a pull request? And we said, I'm sure that this researcher will make a pull request for you. And we went back, and he was like, well, the app is written in Xamarin and C#, and I only know how to program in Go. So what to do now? And so in the end, there were, I think, 4 people, including myself, involved in making this pull request, porting the Go code to C#, making a NuGet package out of it, and introducing it into the app in such a way that it could be toggled on and off, so to not impact the launch of the application. And we were able to complete and merge this around, I think, the beginning of January. And it was turned on in March, I think. So that's the way that uploads of contacts is handled at this moment.
That's pretty incredible. So does that sounds like it makes Norway's app probably the most secure in the world?
It would be if others had established the identity of the user at the point in time when they upload the tokens. So it is a compensation for a reduction in privacy otherwise. But I think it's a very good example of using technology and thinking about privacy to improve a technical solution. It shows that privacy technology is a field of its own. It's not like something you can do as an amateur effort and just slap onto an application. You have to think of it as a primary concern.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably one of the most complex aspects of coding as well, really. It's beyond me.
Well, it is very interesting because I think most people have a pretty good intuition of secure programming, because security is about making sure that people don't get information that they don't have, right? And it's about analyzing who can be a threat to our application, who are our attackers, what kind of threat model do we have to have, what kind of threat actors are out in the world. And privacy basically means that you have to think of yourself as a threat actor. So you have to think of, if I suddenly turn into a bad guy, or if the person who takes my job after me turns into a bad guy, or if the person at the next office turns into a bad guy, or if there is somebody who's holding my family hostage, forcing me to do something, or if somebody gets access to my computer through social engineering or hacking, what can they do with the information they have? So the idea of privacy is that you don't want to possess information that could lead someone in your situation to cause damage, even if you think you're a good person and you're a good person now.
It's a more complex field than I think people give it credit for.
It is, and also there's lots of fun technological solutions that you can put into it as well.
Yeah, so the pull request then, have there been many other people that have actually contributed to the app in this sort of fashion?
I think this is the only significant contribution, and it required a lot of effort. So I think that personally I spent probably about 40 hours on this pull request alone. And that was in the weeks leading up to Christmas, so I didn't have the best Christmas gifts from my kids this year. Luckily, my better half is very good with the gifts, so I was covered.
What's better than the gift of security?
No. Exactly. Now, and here's the final sort of triumph with this story, which is that in May this year, the Norwegian Data Protection Agency awarded this contribution to the contact tracing app with a recognition for privacy by design. So they have a yearly recognition of a significant achievement in privacy by design, and this was this year's winner.
Well, that's fantastic news. Congratulations.
So, and of course, the real innovation there was by the cryptographic researchers. So I got a very nice honorable mention, but it was someone else who got the prize, and that was well deserved.
Well, I mean, it takes many people to contribute to that, but even those 40 hours, as you mentioned, that's quite a lot of work to go into it. I think that's great news. I think it's a really novel approach to have open sourced software like that and be able to accept pull requests, external pull requests. I think I think there's a lot of governments certainly that could learn from that approach.
Yeah, I do think that NHS in Britain has quite a bit of software that's publicly that is opened up. So it does, and it does make sense for a software that's developed with the public's money, for that software to be open. Now, I think that the contributions like this pull request will seldom be significant. It will, because while it might be fun to contribute to a piece of software that you use on your spare time, that's sort of fascinating to you, it might be less tempting to spend your time doing the work of the government for the government.
Yes, maybe.
but it is so it might be just a way to say, if you really care about this so much, then just step up and make a contribution. So it's also a way for the government to shut down unreasonable criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's got a lot of benefits, I think, to being able to do that. I think we, to your point of there being a number of British government services that are available on GitHub, not all of them active repositories, it has to be said, but I think it's a positive sign that we're moving in that direction. But this certainly seems like the biggest success story so far.
Yeah, and I think that of course, I can't read the mind of the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, but I do think that they're quite pleased as well, because now all the talk is about corona certificates and then these digital green certificates. And the Norwegian app for scanning those certificates is actually also open sourced on GitHub at this point in time.
Yeah, so we haven't quite gone that far in the UK yet at the time of recording. We don't have anything that's to do with certificates, or even there's talk about having had the vaccine or a double vax of the vaccine, giving you the ability to then go away on holiday and things like that. But it's not really anything that has been really talked about in terms of like having almost like a vaccine passport or anything like that. But it sounds like you are a little bit further ahead as a country.
Yeah, I do. There's a EU-wide initiative on this. I'm not sure exactly what the rules are.
Oh well, of course we've opted out.
Yeah, of course. Aren't you lucky? Well, you got to change your passports back to blue, wasn't it?
Yeah. We don't have a vaccine passport, but our real passports are blue now, so that's great.
So I have here on my phone. You can see this is this is the national version. It's got so this one says that I can travel in the EU with my little vaccine, and there's a QR code here.
Look at that.
This is Zbor. No, it's a Z-lib encoded Zbor. Excuse me. Z-lib compressed Zbor encoded Java web token. Actually.
Wow.
So if you're familiar with OpenID Connect, the data that's in this QR code is basically a compressed JOT.
Wow, that's pretty cool. But what colour is your passport?
We have red passports, so we didn't.
I mean, to be fair, my passport's red because a few years on that yet. But oh well, I'm sure someone had a great idea about why that would make sense. But obviously, we've missed out on having JOT tokens and a vaccine passport.
Of course, this is a privacy concern here as well. So we have a similar advisory board for these vaccine passports, but.
So have you been able to get yourself onto that advisory group as well for the European Union?
They pretty well, not for the European Union, for the Norwegian implementation of the European Union.
All right, I see.
Yeah, so they pretty much just asked the people who contributed in the contact tracing app to come back for this, and
Makes sense.
Added a few more. But the process is quite different because the privacy concerns are very different in their nature.
So, how are the concerns different? How do you need to solve them differently?
Well, the main concern here is that so the first thing, which I think we had here, which was a big discussion. You got this. This is the EU one. This is blue with yellow font on it. And then you got this one, which is, because I'm vaccinated, it's green with white font on it. And this one is national, and you can see there on the national one, you can see it says JBro ****. And that's that is a privacy concern. That when you show this, you don't necessarily need to provide identification for who you are. Because in most countries we value the freedom of movement quite high. So these vaccine passports, they can be used as sort of a social control or a limitation on who can go where, and even more importantly, we are used to being able to go about in our country without carrying identification papers. Do we want a future where you can be demanded to present your identification papers? Papers, please. And as far as I can see, these are concerns that are much more about law and much more about the legislative process and how the legislation is carried out than it is about technology.
Yeah, I think it depends on how it's used, I suppose, doesn't it? There is definitely some... it's more of a political and law concern, to your point, yeah.
So, for example, our question, which the Parliament has failed to answer, I think, sufficiently, is, if you operate a restaurant, can you demand that people show their certificate in order to enter? Can you demand that they show their driver's license in addition to verify that it's the right person? What can you do if they refuse? Can you? Is it illegal to refuse? Is it illegal to require these kind of identification, and in which situations?
Which direction is Norway going in with that?
Frankly, we don't know, and that has been a fascinating part of being in this discussion, because this is the government and the Parliament is deciding these depending upon how they choose to legislate it. It can either be like parliamentary legislation, or it can be governmental legislation. And that legislation was supposed to be completed before the summer. And as far as I've heard so far, and we promised to be notified if that changed, they haven't actually completed the legislation, but they've rolled out the passports anyway.
Well, that'll be interesting to see how that progresses.
So one thing that's very fascinating about working in privacy, and that's something you'll see with a few other fields as well, is that it is very cross-disciplinary. And when we wrote this joint statement against the first app, a lot of the signatories were also lawyers or legal professionals. And we got a pretty good network with technologists and legal professionals. So we have some people working in the Norwegian bureaucracy. We've got people who are active in the legal department of the local university.
I have to say, I mean, that is very progressive, because I think so often decisions, I think to some extent within the EU, but mostly within the United Kingdom, so decisions that are made around technology are usually made without technologists being present. And I think it's quite novel that you would have such a tightly knit group between technologists, lawyers, etc. And from the conversations we've had with Norwegians on this show, that certainly seems to be, Norway seems to take a very progressive approach to technology, more so than we have in the UK.
Well, I hope so, but around the privacy concerns on the initial tracing application, there was a huge storm around the initial digital contact tracing app in the UK, wasn't there?
Yes, there was, but mostly just because it didn't work. was the main issue? It was internally developed by NHSX, which is essentially a private company. Internally was doing some work on behalf of the NHS, and they built an app that basically just didn't work. It wasn't fit for purpose, and ultimately they had to take the relatively brave decision of throwing it away. I don't think that it was necessarily communicated particularly well in Parliament as to who, what, and why, and also where the money was actually going, because there was a huge. I mean, you can listen to this in more detail on the other episode, but I think in terms of the there was a whole load of money that was spent on contact tracing in general, not just the application development, and it all got rolled up into how many millions or billions of pounds have we spent on an app? And actually, that wasn't quite true. It was all very poorly communicated, which was probably part of the biggest problem. One of the biggest parts of the problem. But yeah, the initial app just didn't work, frankly. That was the main problem.
There was also, from the privacy community, there was a lot of concerns there as well, because at the point in time, there were two basic designs for building these apps. And the one that I mentioned earlier, the DP3T protocol, was originally Switzerland and Italy, I think. And then Germany adopted it. But initially Germany, France, and UK had another approach, which was called Robert, I think. Robust exposure tracking, something like this. Germany abandoned that after privacy concerns, and then UK also followed suit. But I think France
it wasn't really around privacy concerns with the UK. It was more to do with it just didn't work very well. It wasn't very good at detecting whether someone had come into contact with somebody else. It was the whole Bluetooth connectivity, I think, was not really actually picking up contacts. So I think it was just poor coding, mostly.
Yeah, but
I'm sure if it had worked, we probably would have had privacy concerns.
Yeah, the storm around it, the controversy around it, was actually bigger than the one we had in Norway in the public dialogue. So I thought it was interesting because our app was, of course, a lot more invasive in that it collected everybody's information all the time. both Bluetooth contacts and location information to one huge central database. So that was quite invasive.
Yeah, I mean, a different level of controversy, I think, there. Yours actually worked.
Well, we never know if it did, because there's some... as far as I know, there's been a little bit of digging. We've tried to do freedom of information requests, or some of my friends have tried to do that, to find out whether it actually detected any infection, but we have, so far we don't know.
Oh, that's interesting, because I think I'd probably just taken an assumption there that it was working. I mean, at least it was collecting data.
Oh, yeah, it was collecting data, that's for sure.
Well, I think unless there's... I'm sure there's plenty more we could say, and we could go on for ages, but I'm conscious that I've taken quite a lot of your time this evening.
I'm getting pinged by my wife for I think soon it's bedtime for the kids.
Well, I think on that note, then we'll say goodbye. So, thank you very much for joining today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, the pleasure has been mine, Chris.